Take a look at this cave. This is a cave known as Sawney Bean's cave. It's quite beautiful from the outside, and the surrounding countryside and ocean is even more so. But this beauty is deceptive. This cave is actually the site of one of the most gruesome and mysterious stories in Scottish history. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In 1977, theater and drive-in movie audiences flocked in droves to catch the latest movie written and directed by horror icon Wes Craven. Following the success of his directorial debut with the 1972 release of The Last House on the Left, fans of the genre, and him in particular, were eager to see what Craven's twisted mind had been working on for the previous 5 years, and to many, he didn't disappoint. His new movie, The Hills Have Eyes, equally thrilled and disgusted audiences on its release as raked in $25 million at the box office, surpassing the success of his first film. Of course, many big-name film critics said it was too gruesome, but wider audiences of horror genre fans propelled the movie into the status of cult classic. Over the years that followed, it became a film franchise and was even remade in 2006. And judging by the average age of the audience on the channel, you're probably more likely to have only seen that version. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the movie, it sort of starts like this. During a good old-fashioned American road trip in the 1970s, the Carter family is traveling to LA. With a trailer in tow, the father, Bob, pulls into a gas station called Fred's Oasis in a remote area of Nevada. And we're talking extremely remote, like middle of the desert, single road, no other stops for miles in every direction. After they get gas and check the fluids under the hood, Fred warns the family to stay on the main roads, which of course is advice they don't follow. The family car then eventually skids off the highway and wrecks, causing one of their dogs to run off into the Nevada desert hills. And this is where it all begins. There's something in that remote desert living in the caves there that begins systematically stalking and killing them. Now, while Craven certainly had the kind of warped creativity it would take to dream up such a scenario, it was actually during his research following the release of The Last House on the Left that he came across a story so revolting that he couldn't help but let it inspire his next movie. And the story that would end up inspiring The Hills Have Eyes was the story of the Sawney Bean clan. It's uncertain where exactly he was born, but Alexander Bean, also known as Sonnie, likely came into the world in the late 15th century in Scotland. Sonnie was the son of a hedge trimmer and a ditch digger, and as was customary at the time, he would go on to follow in his father's footsteps, or at least attempt to. Pretty quickly, however, his father discovered that a working life didn't appeal to Sonnie. Simply put, and by all accounts, he was lazy and preferred to waste his life daydreaming. This was obviously met with scorn and disappointment from his father, who did all he could to encourage Sonnie into a life of hard labor, but no matter what he tried, nothing worked, and particularly Sonnie. Much of his early life is a bit of a mystery, but at some point in his adult years, he met a woman named Black Agnes Douglas. Around the time of their meeting, she was being accused of witchcraft and was also looking for an escape. So the two would end up being a perfect match, and they ran off together to leave behind a life of servitude, fleeing for the coastal county of Ayrshire, Scotland. Other than the relocation itself, neither of them had much of a plan, but they did manage to find a place to stay that still exists to this day. And this was a place truly befitting of the couple. If you happen to stumble on it, you'd likely miss it altogether, as it's little more than a crack in a rocky cliff. It's located at the north end of Balcruchan Bay, about 5 kilometers north of the community of Ballantree. And it is in fact not a crack at all. It's actually a raised cave that the couple took shelter in and decided to call home. The cave today, which is known as Sawney Bean's Cave, sits right at the high tide mark, and each time high tide rolls in, it floods much of the entrance. For Sonnie and Agnes though, this was just fine, maybe even preferred actually, as they made the inner reaches of the labyrinth of tunnels their main quarters. The cave itself is about 590 feet or 180 meters deep, and its corridors measure about 1 mile in total length. And the combination of all of these factors is credited for the couple going completely and utterly undetected for 25 years. All of those years ago, after relocating without working, however, there was a big problem Sonnie had to contend with. He had to support himself and his wife, and while he could have learned how to fish and lived off the ocean right outside his front door, he opted for a more efficient way to earn money through robbery. In the areas between nearby towns, there were narrow roads that were well traveled, giving him the perfect setting and opportunity to take advantage of travelers, particularly those using the road alone. When a horse or a wagon would reach a certain point in the woods, he'd jump out, force the travelers to stop, and then take whatever he could from them. Often this would include jewelry, currency, food, and other supplies. Then, once he had everything he could grab, he disappeared into the woods and brought the spoils back to the cave where Agnes was waiting. For a time this was enough, but Sonnie apparently started to wonder about the chances of him being caught. The penalty for the crimes he was perpetrating during the time period was death, so leaving witnesses was a risky proposition. To resolve this matter, Sonnie came up with a fairly simple and straightforward plan. If there were no witnesses to the crime, how could he ever be caught? Almost as soon as the idea struck him, he put the plan into action and soon realized this created another problem though, which was disposing of the evidence. If the local authorities were made aware of dead bodies left lying in the woods, it would almost certainly result in an extensive manhunt to find the killer. But rather than focus on the problem, Sonnie, despite his apparent laziness, was a solution-minded individual, and he figured he could actually solve several issues all at once. To remain undetected while visiting local shops and merchants was nearly impossible, so trading in the goods he took from travelers was a risk he no longer wanted to take. To that point, he'd been trading valuable items for food, but if he just killed the travelers and brought the bodies back to the cave with him, he and Agnes would also never have to worry about food again. And so it went afterward, with Sonnie continuing to ambush travelers on the narrow roads between villages. He'd lure them off their horses and wagons, quickly dispatch them, and then drag them into the cave where Agnes would prepare them. Prior to this, the couple had been nearly starving, but now they had a steady supply of food, and high-protein food at that. Soon, they both regained their strength, and in doing so, the couple began to have children. Before long, they had 14 kids, 8 sons and 6 daughters, all of which were fed what Sonnie brought back from the moment they could eat solid food. In fact, as the children became old enough, they start to join Sonnie in his attacks on travelers, and all the extra help made for much lighter work for their father. When more of them were joining Sonnie on his daily duties, the Bean clan was able to start picking off larger traveling parties, sometimes dispatching upwards of 6 people in one ambush. Years apparently passed like this as the Bean clan continued to make a deplorable living for themselves. And as if things weren't disturbing enough, the kids eventually started to have kids of their own. And this wasn't from finding outside partners, if you know what I mean. After a long enough span, the family that once began as 2 had grown to 46, with all of them living inside the cave together and all of them hunting travelers together. As you might imagine, the constantly growing list of missing people was noticed by the nearby villagers, and desperate for justice, they first began to point fingers at one another. The brunt of the blame initially fell on local innkeepers, since the inns were often the last place those went missing were seen. Untold numbers of innocent people were wrongly accused of being responsible for the disappearances, and were sentenced to capital punishment, with not a single one of them confessing to the crimes on the gallows. After enough of these, attention began to shift to where all of these disappearances had been taking place. If it wasn't these condemned people, maybe there was some other explanation. Local authorities eventually organized massive searches in hopes of finding some feral group of people living in the forest, but efforts came up empty. In fact, during one scan of the coastline, a member of a search party even came across the entrance to Sawney Bean's cave and pointed it out to the others. But everyone would agree that there was no way anyone could live and survive inside a sea cave. So, more years went by, and the Bean clan only got better and better at their family profession. The ambushes on travelers were executed with military-like precision, and there was never a shortage of victims. The family apparently also became nocturnal, remaining in the cave throughout the day and coming out at night to hunt unfortunate travelers. And because they were bringing in more than they could eat at any one time, the women learned to salt and pickle the meat to preserve it. But even then, there would be a constant stench of rotting flesh permeating through the cave. After a while, the Beans took to just tossing limbs into the ocean outside the cave entrance. And soon enough, these parts would wash ashore and be discovered by villagers, leading many to believe that the epidemic of missing persons was instead caused by animals. These prosperous times for the Bean clan, however, wouldn't last forever. One evening in the year 1600, darkness had just fallen when a couple was returning from a fair along the narrow road which the Beans had made their hunting ground. With the man riding on the front of the horse and the woman riding just behind him, the Bean clan emerged from the dark woods on all sides of them. The Bean women then grabbed the woman and pulled her off the horse onto the ground, immediately attacking her and beginning to essentially pull her apart. The way they descended was so quick and so gruesome that she was almost in pieces by the time she touched the ground. And upon seeing this, her husband was horrified and overtaken by rage. And unlike their previous victims, he had been trained in combat. He fought against the family as they tried to pull him from the horse, but the man soon pulled out his sword and a pistol. Then, moments later, about 20 to 30 other travelers returning from the fair happened upon the scene and rushed to join the fight. This was the first time the Beans ever faced serious resistance, and it soon became clear that they were not going to win this one. So all at once, they scattered back into the forest and returned to the cave, leaving behind a scene of carnage. It's unclear if the Beans immediately knew the consequences of their first failed attack, but this was the first time they had ever left behind a living witness. The other travelers then accompanied the man who was attacked all the way to Glasgow, Scotland, where he spoke to the chief magistrate about his experience in the woods. And as the man told his story, the chief magistrate began to connect the dots that had been missing for decades to that point. The growing list of missing travelers, the body parts washing up in nearby villages, everything started to make sense with the story of the ambush. The chief magistrate then decided to do something that was well beyond usual protocol for the time. He marched the man right to King James IV, who just so happened to have taken a keen interest in the pattern of missing persons in Scotland, and he had also developed a theory that witchcraft was to blame. The king then listened intently as the man retold the story of his wife's death and the animalistic behavior of her attackers. Immediately upon the story's conclusion, the king gathered an army of 400 men and a pack of tracking hounds, and the large caravan began heading toward Ayrshire. As the king and his army traveled, the caravan apparently grew with volunteers jumping in line to aid in the search for the perpetrators. And leading the way was the man whose wife was viciously attacked by the Sawney Bean clan. Upon reaching Ayrshire, the search area extended throughout the countryside and along the coastline, but at first, there were no signs at all of some rogue families living in the forest. When the party passed in front of Sawney Bean's cave, the opening in the rocks wasn't even paid attention to by them, but the dogs were a different story. All at once, the hounds began to pull wildly on their leads and howl in the direction of the rocky cliff. It wasn't until someone inspected the narrow cave entrance that the king, who had already passed by, was told about the find and backtracked. It's just that from the outside of the cave, no one could fathom that anyone would be living or even hiding out inside the tunnel, as all they could see from the sand was darkness beyond the opening. The dogs, however, continued to make it clear that there was more to it. Soon enough, as many men as could fit inside the cave lit torches and began to slowly make their way down the tunnel. The further and further they went, the more prevalent the smell became, causing them to realize what the dogs had alerted them to. When the soldiers reached the very end of the tunnel, about a mile from the entrance, they were greeted by an unimaginable sight. Apparently, parts of all kinds were strung up along the cave walls around barrels for pickling, making the entire space look like a butcher shop. To the side of the main living area were piles of clothing, jewelry, and bones, and in the middle of it all was the entire Bean clan, looking just as surprised as the men who came upon them. When the shock wore off, the Beans attempted to fight, but they were quickly subdued thanks to being greatly outnumbered. Then, once every man, woman, and child in the family was captured, they were marched to a nearby village where the king decided to forego the established justice system, sentencing each member of the Bean clan to capital punishment. The day after their capture, the family was taken to Leith, where they would succumb to a particularly brutal punishment. The men would go on to have each of their limbs removed and were left to succumb to blood loss, while the women watched in horror. And as they witnessed this slow process happen to the men in the Bean family, the army prepared 3 large bonfires. Then once all the men were gone, the women were given the fate typical of witches of the air, bringing an end to the story of the ruthless Bean clan. Now, if you're wondering why some of the elements of the story seem to not make sense, you're not the only one. Many people have asked, and rightfully so, did this actually happen? And while Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes is unquestionably a work of pure fiction, the tale of the Bean clan has often been presented as verified fact. The truth is, though, there's a significant amount of supporting information and evidence that's missing from the tale. Historians have scoured records, newspapers, and diaries of the time in Scotland, and not a single one of them mentions a trend of disappearing travelers. And certainly, you have to imagine the discovery of a person-eating family of 46 would have made the news. So how exactly did this story come about? The beginnings of the story have been traced back to a publication that was popular in the 18th and 19th centuries called the Newgate Calendar. This publication told of crimes of the day with a sensationalized twist, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction when it comes to the Bean clan. Others, however, maintain that there are at least bits and pieces of truth woven into the story of the Bean clan. Centuries earlier, there was a slightly more evident story of a man named Christy Cleek, a butcher said to have turned to eating whatever he could find during a devastating 14th century famine. He apparently also led a small band of outlaws who preyed on travelers, which sounds remarkably similar to the Bean clan story. There's also the undeniable history of banditry and smuggling along the Ayrshire coast, where caves were used as hideouts for ambushes. So combine all these together with broken telephone across decades and you have the perfect mix for the birth of a legend about a grotesque, cave-dwelling, flesh-eating clan. So what do you think? Do you think the legend is just that, or do you think there's more to the story? If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.